I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped off that transport truck. Not because of anything obvious, just this feeling that crawled up my spine and made me want to turn around and climb right back in. But orders are orders, and mine said report to Outpost Delta 7 for indefinite assignment. The driver barely slowed down long enough for me to grab my gear and hop out. He gave me a quick salute through the window, then gunned it back down the dirt road, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and exhaust fumes. I watched his taillights disappear into the heat shimmer until there was nothing left but silence. That's when the isolation really hit me. I'd been in remote places before. Baghdad had its share of desolate fobs where you could go days without seeing anything but sand and concrete barriers. But this was different. This felt like the edge of the world. Rolling desert stretched out in every direction, broken only by the occasional scrub brush or boulder. The sky was so wide and empty it made me dizzy to look up at it for too long. About a mile to the east, something caught my attention. A structure of some kind dark against the horizon. From this distance I couldn't make out any details, but it looked substantial. Definitely man-made. I made a mental note to ask someone about it later. The outpost itself sat in a shallow depression, probably chosen to keep it out of sight from the main road. Smart positioning, though. I couldn't imagine who they were trying to hide from out here. A collection of low, rectangular buildings surrounded a central courtyard area. Everything looked sun-bleached and weathered, like it had been baking in this heat for decades, which, as it turned out, it pretty much had. My first stop was the command building, a squat concrete structure that looked like it had been dropped here sometime during the Cold War and forgotten. The whole place had that institutional military feel, functional, but depressing. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. A tall, broad-shouldered man in crisp officer's fatigues looked up from a desk covered in paperwork. Gray streaked through his dark hair, and his blue eyes had the kind of intensity that made you want to stand straighter without being told. Mercado? Yes, sir. Reporting as ordered. Captain Theo Graves, welcome to Delta 7. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Have a seat. I sat down and waited while he shuffled through some files. The office was sparse, a few maps tacked to the walls, a radio unit in the corner, and not much else. No personal touches, no photos, just the basics. Your assignment here is open-ended, Graves said without looking up. Perimeter security, equipment maintenance, general support duties. You'll be briefed on specifics by your squad leader. He finally made eye contact. Any questions? I had about a dozen, starting with what exactly we were supposed to be securing out here, but something in his tone suggested this wasn't the time. No, sir. Good. Sergeant Sullivan will show you to your quarters and get you oriented. He was already turning back to his paperwork before I stood up. The barracks turned out to be exactly what I'd expected. Long, narrow buildings with rows of metal bunks and wall lockers. Everything was clean but worn, like it had housed thousands of soldiers over the years. My assigned bunk was about halfway down one of the rows with a thin mattress and scratchy wool blankets. I was still unpacking my gear when someone walked up behind me. You must be the new guy. I turned around to find a stocky Hispanic man about my age grinning at me. He had thick black hair and a neatly trimmed goatee, and something about his relaxed posture made him seem immediately approachable. Hey, Brandon Griffith, he said, extending his hand. Been here about 6 months. Caden Mercado just got in. Yeah, I saw the truck drop you off. Welcome to paradise. He gestured around the barracks with obvious sarcasm. Hope you like the color beige because that's about all you're gonna see for a while. I laughed despite myself. After the formal reception from Graves, it felt good to talk to someone normal. So what's the deal with this place? Graves wasn't exactly chatty about the details. That's Graves for you. Man of few words. Brandon sat down on the bunk across from mine. Honestly, I'm still figuring it out myself. We're supposed to be monitoring some kind of research facility, but mostly we just sit around and make sure nobody wanders into restricted areas. Research facility? Yeah, that building you probably saw on your way in. About a mile east of here. Off limits to us grunts, but sometimes you can see vehicles coming and going. He shrugged. Above our pay grade, you know? That explained the structure on the horizon. I filed that information away for later. Over the next few days, Brandon showed me around and introduced me to the rest of the team. The setup was pretty standard for a small outpost, minimal staff covering essential functions. Everyone had multiple responsibilities, and the duty rotation meant you got to know people fast. Mildred Neal ran communications from a cramped room full of radio equipment and computer terminals. She was blonde, freckled, and probably the most technically competent person on the base. When I met her, she was troubleshooting some kind of signal interference that had been plaguing their equipment for weeks. Probably atmospheric distortion, she explained, adjusting dials on a radio panel. This whole area's weird for electronics. GPS gets screwy sometimes, too. She seemed nice enough, but there was something anxious about the way she constantly monitored her equipment, like she was waiting for bad news to come through. Hayden Jimenez handled security, which mostly meant walking perimeter checks and manning observation posts. He was a big guy with a shaved head and intense brown eyes, the kind of soldier who took his job seriously even when nothing was happening. When Brandon introduced us, Hayden was coming back from a patrol, tactical vest loaded with gear. "How's it look out there?" Brandon asked. "Same as always. Whole lot of nothing." But Hayden kept glancing east toward that distant building like he expected to see something different. Jake Elliott ran the mess hall, such as it was. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s who seemed perpetually annoyed about something. Usually the quality of the supplies he had to work with. "Hope you like canned everything," he told me during my first meal. "'Cause that's what we got. Canned beans, canned corn, canned mystery meat. Fresh stuff comes in once a week if we're lucky." The food was exactly as uninspiring as advertised, but Jake kept everyone fed, and that counted for something. Kim Ortiz was the medical officer, a small woman with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and glasses that made her look younger than her age. She ran a tight medical bay with supplies that were basic but adequate for the minor injuries and illnesses you'd expect in a place like this. "Nothing too exciting so far," she told me during my check-in exam. Couple of heat exhaustion cases, some minor cuts and bruises. Biggest challenge is boredom-related complaints. She had a calm, professional manner that was reassuring, though I noticed she kept glancing at a calendar on her wall like she was counting down to something. The days started blending together pretty quickly. Wake up, chow. Duty assignments, more chow. Evening duties, sleep. Repeat. The routine was mind-numbing in a way that reminded me of garrison life back at Fort Hood, except here you couldn't even drive into town for a beer when you were off duty. There was no town within 50 miles. Brandon and I fell into an easy friendship, the kind that develops when you're stuck in the same small space with the same people day after day. We'd play cards in the evening, share stories about our previous assignments, complain about the heat and the food and the endless sameness of desert life. "You ever wonder what we're really doing here?" he asked one evening as we sat outside the barracks watching the sun go down. "What do you mean?" "I mean this whole setup. 9 people to monitor one building seems like overkill." He gestured toward the research facility, now just a dark silhouette against the orange sky. "And why here? Middle of nowhere, no strategic value I can see." I'd been wondering the same thing, but I'd learned not to ask too many questions about assignments that didn't make immediate sense. The army had its reasons, even when those reasons weren't obvious to the people carrying out the orders. "Maybe that's the point," I said. "Keep whatever they're doing away from prying eyes." "Yeah, maybe." But Brandon didn't sound convinced. The weeks rolled by with the same deadening predictability. Morning PT in the courtyard while the sun climbed over the eastern mountains. Equipment checks and maintenance duties. Perimeter patrols that never turned up anything more interesting than the occasional lizard. Meals that tasted the same regardless of what Jake claimed to be serving. The isolation was the worst part. Back in Baghdad, at least there was the constant possibility of action. Patrols, convoys, the adrenaline rush of staying alert in hostile territory. Here, the biggest excitement was when the weekly supply truck arrived with fresh batteries and canned peaches. I started having trouble sleeping, lying awake in my bunk listening to the desert wind and the occasional coyote howl. My mind would drift back to Baghdad, to the friends I'd lost and the close calls that still woke me up in cold sweats. At least there I'd felt useful, like I was accomplishing something. Here I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just marking time. But I adapted, the way you do. Found small things to focus on, keeping my gear in perfect order, helping Jake inventory supplies, volunteering for extra duty shifts just to break up the monotony. The key was not thinking too far ahead, not dwelling on how long this assignment might last or what I'd do when it was over. None of us realized that the routine itself was the trap, that the endless mind-numbing repetition of days was wearing down our defenses, making us vulnerable to something that had been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to surface. Looking back now, I can see the signs that should have warned us. The way electronics malfunctioned for no apparent reason. The strange dreams that started plaguing everyone around the same time. The fact that nobody ever talked about their previous assignment or why they'd been sent to Delta 7. But at the time, we just thought we were bored soldiers stuck in the middle of nowhere, counting down the days until we could return to the real world. We had no idea the real world was already much farther away than any of us could have imagined. That morning started like any other until I rolled over and saw Brandon's bunk. Not just empty, stripped bare. His gear was gone, boots missing from under his rack, even his pillow. Like he'd packed up and walked out in the middle of the night. I sat up, running a hand through my hair. Brandon wasn't the type to pull some stupid prank, and he sure as hell wouldn't go AWOL over nothing. The guy took regulations seriously. Maybe too seriously sometimes. "Brandon?" My voice carried across the empty barracks. Nothing came back except the hum of the air conditioning unit working overtime against the desert heat. I threw on my fatigues and headed straight for Sergeant Sullivan's quarters. Found him already dressed, working through paperwork at his desk with the kind of focus that meant he was trying to ignore something. "Oh, Sergeant, Brandon Griffith's missing." Sullivan looked up from his reports, those gray eyes sharpening. He'd been running this outpost long enough to know when something was off. "Missing how?" "Bunk's empty. All his gear's gone. Looks like he cleared out sometime during the night." Sullivan pushed back from his desk and stood up. At 38, he'd seen enough soldiers crack under pressure to take this seriously. "Rivera and Casey are on duty rotation. We'll get them together and sweep the perimeter." 20 minutes later, we were geared up and heading into the desert. The sun was already climbing, turning the air into something you had to work to breathe. Jim Rivera looked nervous, constantly adjusting his equipment and checking his water supply. Stevie Casey stayed quiet, but I could see him calculating distances and directions like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "We'll work in a grid pattern," Sullivan said, checking his compass. "Mercado, you take the northeast quadrant with Rivera. Casey and I will cover the south." The desert stretched out in every direction, nothing but sand and scrub brush and heat that made the horizon dance. We'd been walking for maybe 2 hours when Rivera called out, "Sergeant, got something." We all converged on his position. footprints in a patch of softer sand heading away from the base. Bare feet, which made no sense. Brandon would never leave his boots behind. "These are fresh," Casey said, crouching down to examine the tracks. "Maybe 6-8 hours old." Sullivan nodded. "We follow them." The trail led us deeper into the wasteland, past rocky outcroppings and dried creek beds that hadn't seen water in months. The prints were erratic, sometimes wandering in wide circles before continuing in a straight line again. Like whoever made them was confused or drunk or both. It was Rivera who spotted him first, about 5 miles out from base. A dark shape against a cluster of boulders, motionless in the shade. "There!" We ran the last 100 yards. Brandon was alive, but barely. Completely naked, his skin burned red and peeling, lips cracked so badly they were bleeding. He was conscious but not tracking, eyes unfocused and rolling back in his head. "Jesus Christ," Sullivan muttered, already pulling out his radio. "Base, this is Search Team Alpha. We've got Griffith. He's in bad shape. We need immediate medical assistance." I knelt next to Brandon, trying to get his attention. His breathing was shallow and rapid, classic signs of severe dehydration. When I touched his shoulder, his skin was burning hot. "Brandon, can you hear me?" "It's Caden." His eyes found mine, but something was wrong with his expression, like he was seeing something that wasn't there. "The voices," he whispered so quietly I had to lean in to catch it. "They kept calling." We got him back to base as fast as we could, taking turns carrying him when he couldn't walk anymore. Kim Ortiz met us at the medical bay, already prepared with IV fluids and cooling blankets. She worked efficiently, checking his vitals and getting the dehydration under control while the rest of us stood around feeling useless. "He's going to be okay," she said after an hour of treatment. "Severe sunburn and heat exhaustion, but nothing permanent. Give him 48 hours and he should be back on his feet." But Brandon wasn't okay. Not really. As the fluids brought him back to awareness, he started talking. Rambling, really, about things that didn't make sense. "I heard you calling," he said, looking directly at me while I sat next to his bed. "All night long, you kept saying my name, telling me to come outside." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Brandon, I was asleep. I didn't call you." "No, it was your voice." "I know your voice, Caden. You kept saying you needed help, that something was wrong. So I got up and followed it." Ortiz checked his temperature again, frowning at the reading. "Hallucinations aren't uncommon with severe dehydration," she said. "The brain starts playing tricks." But Brandon shook his head, more alert now and insistent. "It wasn't a hallucination. I followed your voice for miles. You were always just ahead, around the next rock or over the next hill. Every time I got close, you'd call from somewhere else." The way he said it, with complete conviction, made my skin crawl. I'd been dead asleep all night, hadn't left my bunk until morning. There was no way I could have been out there. "Brandon, listen to me. I was in the barracks all night. Ask Rivera. He was on watch duty. He would have seen me if I'd left." "Then who was calling me?" None of us had an answer for that. Word spread fast around the outpost. By evening, everyone knew Brandon had wandered naked into the desert, following voices that weren't there. The official explanation was heat-induced psychosis, but I could see the doubt in people's faces. Soldiers started looking over their shoulders more, checking locks twice before going to sleep. Jake Elliott burned dinner that night, too distracted to pay attention to the stove. Mildred Neal jumped every time the radio crackled with static. Even Hayden Jimenez, who usually patrolled the perimeter with military precision, kept glancing out at the desert like he expected to see something moving in the darkness. The tension was thick enough to cut. During evening chow, conversations died whenever someone mentioned Brandon's name. People ate faster than usual, eager to get back to the safety of the barracks. That night, I lay in my bunk listening to Brandon's steady breathing from across the room. Ortiz had cleared him for light duty, said the crisis was over. But every time I started to drift off, I'd remember the certainty in his voice when he talked about hearing me call his name. I must have checked the locks on our door 3 times before finally settling down. Even then, sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about those footprints in the sand, wandering in circles like someone who was lost, or following something that kept moving just out of reach. The desert outside our windows looked different now. Not empty anymore, but watching. Waiting for the next person to hear their name called in a voice they trusted. I rolled over and pulled my pillow over my head, but it didn't help. Because now I was wondering if Brandon's hallucinations had really been caused by the heat, or if something else was out there in the darkness. Something that knew our voices well enough to use them against us. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the barracks window, and the immediate realization that something felt off. Brandon's bunk sat empty, the thin military-issue blanket pulled back and twisted like he'd gotten up in a hurry. Nothing unusual there. He'd been having trouble sleeping since his episode with the voices. But when I rolled over to check the time, I spotted something that made my stomach drop. A piece of paper lay folded on his pillow, torn from what looked like a field notebook, the edges rough where he'd ripped it free. I picked it up and unfolded it, recognizing Brandon's handwriting immediately. The words were scrawled in pencil, pressed hard enough to leave indentations in the paper. "They're calling me." That was it. No explanation, no signature, just those 3 words written with the kind of urgency that made my hands shake as I read them. I checked my watch, 06:30. Morning formation wasn't until 0700, but Brandon never missed breakfast. The mess hall had become his anchor point after his breakdown, the one place where he seemed to relax. I pulled on my fatigues and boots, grabbed the note, and headed straight for Graves' office. The hallway felt too quiet for this time of morning. Usually you'd hear movement from the other rooms, guys getting ready for another day of monitoring empty radio frequencies and staring at the perimeter fence. Today it felt like walking through a tomb. Graves was already at his desk when I knocked, probably had been for hours. The man seemed to function on about 3 hours of sleep and black coffee. He looked up when I entered, took one glance at my expression, and gestured for me to sit. "What is it, Mercado?" I handed him the note without saying anything. Watched his face as he read it, saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. He set the paper down on his desk and leaned back in his chair. "When did you last see Griffith?" "Yesterday around 2100. He said he was going to try to get some sleep." "Anyone else see him after that?" "I don't know, sir. I was out until lights out myself." Graves stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the compound. From his office, you could see most of the base, the motor pool, the communications building, the perimeter fence that marked the edge of our little world. Beyond that, nothing but desert and that building in the distance that nobody talked about anymore. "I'll organize another search," he said. "Full sweep this time. Check every building, every vehicle, every inch of this base." The search took most of the morning. Sullivan organized the teams, dividing the compound into grids. We went through the barracks again, the mess hall, the communications center, even the storage sheds that hadn't been opened in months. I found myself hoping we'd discover Brandon passed out in some corner, maybe dealing with another episode like before. At least that would mean he was still here. But we found nothing. No sign he'd ever left his bunk, no footprints leading away from the barracks, no indication of where he might have gone. It was like he'd simply vanished into thin air, leaving only that note behind. Sullivan called off the search around 1300 hours. I could see the frustration in his face as he gathered the teams together near the motor pool. 2 soldiers missing in less than a month. First, whatever happened to those guys who supposedly transferred out, now Brandon. The math wasn't adding up and everybody knew it. That afternoon, I tried to focus on my regular duties, monitoring the radio frequencies and filing the standard reports that documented absolutely nothing happening. But I kept thinking about Brandon's note, about the certainty in those 3 words. They're calling me. Not I think I hear something or I'm going to investigate. Just a simple statement of fact, like he had no choice in the matter. Over the next few days, I started watching Rivera more carefully. He'd been quiet since Brandon's disappearance, more withdrawn than usual. Rivera was normally the guy who'd crack jokes during formation or start up conversations in the mess hall. Now he ate his meals in silence and kept to himself during off-duty hours. The first sign something was wrong came on Tuesday evening. I was walking past the communications building when I heard Rivera talking to someone inside. Nothing unusual there. He'd been pulling extra shifts since we were short-handed. But as I got closer, I realized he was the only voice I could hear. No radio chatter, no responses from whoever he was supposedly talking to. I stopped outside the door and listened. Rivera's voice carried through the thin walls, but I couldn't make out the words clearly. It sounded like he was having a conversation, pausing between sentences like he was listening to responses. But the building was completely quiet except for his voice. When I knocked and entered, Rivera was sitting at the radio station with his headset on. He looked up when he saw me, pulled the headset off, and tried to smile. "Hey, Caden, what's up? Who were you talking to?" "Just checking the frequencies, making sure everything's clear." I looked at the radio equipment. The main transmitter was off, the frequency dials set to positions that didn't correspond to any of our standard channels. Rivera followed my gaze and quickly reached over to adjust the settings, his hands moving fast like he was trying to cover something up. "Everything okay, Rivera?" "Yeah, man, just tired. Been pulling a lot of doubles lately." But he wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it, and his hands were shaking as he fumbled with the radio controls. I stayed there for a few more minutes making small talk about the duty roster and the weather, watching him carefully. Every few seconds he'd glance at the headset like he was waiting for it to say something. Wednesday night I was coming back from the latrine around 2300 when I heard it myself. A voice coming from Rivera's bunk, low and conversational. I moved closer, trying not to make noise on the wooden floor. Rivera was awake, sitting up in his bed, talking to someone I couldn't see. "I know," he was saying. "I know you're right. But I can't just..." He stopped mid-sentence, tilted his head like he was listening. Then he nodded and continued. "Brandon understood. That's why he went. That's why he had to go." The way he said it made my skin crawl. Not like he was remembering something Brandon had told him, but like he was talking about information he'd received recently. From someone who knew what had happened to Brandon. I backed away from his bunk and returned to my own, but I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear Rivera whispering. Sometimes it sounded like responses to questions, sometimes like he was arguing with someone. Once I heard him laugh, a sound so unlike his normal laugh that I had to check to make sure it was really him. Thursday morning, Rivera looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembled when he tried to drink his coffee, and he kept looking over his shoulder like he expected to see someone following him. During formation, he swayed on his feet, and Sullivan had to call his name twice before he responded to a direct question. "Rivera, you feeling all right?" Sullivan asked. "Yes, Sergeant, just tired." "Maybe you should see Ortiz, get checked out." "I'm fine, Sergeant, really." But he wasn't fine. None of us were. But Rivera was getting worse fast. By Thursday evening, he'd stopped responding to direct questions unless you said his name multiple times. He'd stand in the middle of conversations looking like he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. During dinner, he picked at his food and kept turning his head toward the windows, like something outside was calling for his attention. Friday night, I woke up around 0200 to find Rivera's bunk empty. I checked the latrine, the common area, even walked outside to see if he was pulling some kind of unofficial guard duty. Nothing. I was about to wake Sullivan when I heard voices coming from the communications building. I made my way across the compound, staying in the shadows near the buildings. The voices got clearer as I approached. Rivera talking to someone, but again only his voice carrying through the night air. I crept around to the side of the building where I could see through one of the windows. Rivera stood in the middle of the room facing the far wall. His back was to me, but I could see his posture, rigid, almost at attention. He was speaking in a low, steady voice, pausing between sentences like he was taking part in a formal conversation. "Yes, I understand," he said. "The same as Brandon. The same as the others." Others. That word hit me like a punch to the chest. What others? How many people had gone missing from this place? "I know where to go," Rivera continued. "I know what I have to do." He turned slightly and I got a glimpse of his face in profile. His expression was completely blank, like he was sleepwalking. But his eyes were wide open, focused on something I couldn't see. I tried to get closer to see if I could figure out what he was looking at. But my boot scraped against the side of the building. Rivera's head snapped toward the sound, and for a second his eyes seemed to focus on the window where I was hiding. Then he smiled, the same empty smile Brandon had worn during his episode, and walked out of the building. I followed him at a distance, staying far enough back that he wouldn't spot me. He walked with purpose, not the wandering gait of someone having a breakdown. He knew exactly where he was going. He stopped at the eastern edge of the base perimeter, right where the fence met the guard post that had been empty since our first week here. Beyond the fence, maybe 2 miles out, I could see the outline of that building against the stars. Rivera stood perfectly still, staring at it like he was waiting for instructions. I crept closer, close enough to hear him mumbling under his breath. The words made no sense. Fragments of sentences mixed with what sounded like responses to questions nobody was asking. But the tone was wrong, like he was reciting lines from a script he'd memorized but didn't understand. I stepped out from behind the guard post, moving slowly so I wouldn't startle him. "Rivera. Hey, Rivera." He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. His eyes remained fixed on that distant building and his lips kept moving in that same rhythmic pattern. I got close enough to touch his shoulder. "Rivera, it's me. Caden, you need to come back to the barracks." Nothing. He might as well have been made of stone. I shook his shoulder gently, then harder when he still didn't react. His body moved with the motion but snapped right back to the same position like he was magnetized to that spot. "Jim," I said, using his first name. "Jim, look at me." For just a second, his mumbling stopped. His head turned slightly in my direction, and I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Then his face went blank again, and he turned back toward the building. "They're waiting," he said, clear as day. "They're waiting for me to come home." The way he said home made my blood run cold. This place wasn't home to any of us. Home was thousands of miles away in places with names like Detroit and Phoenix and San Antonio. This was just a temporary assignment, a dot on a map that most people would never see or care about. I tried talking to him for another 10 minutes, using every approach I could think of. I asked about his family, his girlfriend back in Michigan, the Tigers' chances this season. All the things that used to get him talking during downtime. I even tried ordering him back to quarters, using the same tone Sullivan used during formation. Nothing worked. Rivera stood there like a statue, mumbling phrases that didn't connect to anything I said. The only time he reacted at all was when I tried to physically pull him away from the fence. His whole body went rigid, and he made a sound I'd never heard from him before. Somewhere between a growl and a whimper, like an animal protecting something valuable. Eventually, I gave up and went to find Sullivan. The sergeant took one look at Rivera and immediately called for Ortiz to bring a sedative. But by the time they got back to the perimeter, Rivera was gone. We searched until dawn, covering the same ground we'd searched for Brandon just days before. Found the same thing too. Absolutely nothing. No footprints leading away from where Rivera had been standing. No sign of which direction he'd gone. No trace that he'd ever been there at all. Sullivan stood at the spot where Rivera had been, looking out at the desert like he expected to see him walking back. The sun was coming up, painting the landscape in shades of orange and red that should have been beautiful but just looked ominous. 2 men in 4 days, Sullivan said. This isn't random. I thought about Rivera's blank expression, about the way he'd said they're waiting, about Brandon's note and that certainty in his voice during his episode, about the voices that seemed so real to them and completely silent to everyone else. No, I said. It's not random at all. But I didn't tell Sullivan about the pattern I was starting to see, about the way both men had talked like they were receiving instructions from someone who knew exactly what they wanted. I kept that to myself, along with the growing certainty that whatever was taking my friends wasn't done yet. By morning, Rivera had vanished as completely as Brandon, leaving the rest of us to wonder who would be next, and whether any of us would make it home to the real world we'd left behind. The kind of person who could maintain radio contact during a sandstorm while half the equipment sparked and died around her. Neil now jumped every time static broke through her headset, and her hands shook when she adjusted the frequencies. I found her in the comm room after mess on a Tuesday, hunched over her equipment with dark circles under her eyes. The radio crackled with the usual background noise, distant chatter from other outposts, weather reports, the occasional burst of interference that came with being stuck in the middle of nowhere. "Hey Neil, everything good in here?" She looked up fast like I'd caught her doing something wrong. Her fingers stayed wrapped around the headset cord. "Oh, hey, Mercado, yeah, just running diagnostics." The way she said it didn't match what I was seeing. Half her monitoring equipment was dark, and the frequency scanner sat silent on the desk beside her. Whatever she was doing, diagnostics wasn't it. "Mind if I ask what kind of diagnostics?" Neil glanced at the door, then back at me. Something in her expression made me step closer and lower my voice. "There's been interference," she said. "Started about a week ago. Comes through on multiple frequencies, always between 0200 and 0400 hours. What kind of interference?" "That's just it. It's not interference. It's structured. Like someone's broadcasting, but the signal doesn't match any known format. No identification codes, no standardized protocols, and the source..." She trailed off, her fingers tightening around the cord. "Where's it coming from?" "Local, maybe 2 clicks out, northwest quadrant." She met my eyes. "Right where that old building sits." The building. Of course it was the building. I should have known Neil would eventually pick up something from that direction. Her equipment was sensitive enough to catch whispers from halfway across the country when atmospheric conditions lined up right. "You report this to Graves?" What am I supposed to tell him? That I'm picking up mysterious signals from an abandoned structure? He'd have me pulled from duty for stress evaluation. She had a point. Graves operated by the book, and the book didn't have chapters on unexplained radio transmissions from empty buildings. He'd assumed Neil was cracking under pressure, same as he'd assumed with Brandon and Rivera. "What does it sound like?" Neil hesitated, then reached for a small recording device on her desk. Her hand hovered over the playback button. I managed to capture about 30 seconds of it, but Mercado... Once you hear this, you can't unhear it, and I think that might be the problem. She pressed play. At first, nothing came through the speakers except low static. Then underneath the white noise, I caught something else, a rhythm. Not quite music, not quite speech, but definitely intentional. The sound seemed to move like someone walking in circles while humming a tune that almost made sense but never quite resolved. The recording ended, leaving us in silence. That's it? That's enough. Neil ejected the recording and slipped it into her pocket. I've been hearing variations of it every night for a week. Sometimes it's clearer, sometimes it's just fragments, but it's always the same basic pattern. And you think it's connected to what happened to Brandon and Rivera. I think they heard it too. Brandon mentioned strange sounds the night before his episode. And Rivera, the day before he disappeared, he asked me if our equipment ever picked up local transmissions. Said he'd been hearing something that didn't sound right. The pieces clicked together in a way I didn't like. 3 people hearing something, 3 people acting strange, 3 people gone. Neil made 4, which meant she was already further down the path than I wanted to think about. Have you been sleeping? Not much. She rubbed her eyes. Hard to sleep when you know that signal's going to come through. And lately, even when I'm not in here, I swear I can still hear it. Like an echo that won't fade. That was exactly what I'd been afraid she'd say. 2 days later, I learned that Jimenez had abandoned his security post sometime during the night shift. Casey found him the next morning sitting outside the motor pool with his back against a supply crate, mumbling to himself and staring in the direction of the northwest quadrant. I was crossing the compound when Casey flagged me down, looking rattled in a way I'd never seen before. The kid was usually unshakable, came from a family of cops, and had that steady confidence that runs in those bloodlines. But now he kept glancing over his shoulder like something was following him. Mercado, you need to see this. He led me to where Jimenez sat in the shade of the supply depot. Our security officer looked like he hadn't slept in days. His uniform was wrinkled, his hair stuck up at odd angles, and his eyes had that glassy quality I'd started associating with people who were about to disappear. Jimenez, you all right? He looked at me without really seeing me, then turned back toward the northwest. His lips moved constantly, but the words came out too quiet to understand. How long has he been like this? Found him here about an hour ago, Casey said. His post was empty when I did morning rounds. No sign of struggle, no indication where he went. Just gone from his station and sitting here instead. I knelt down beside Jimenez and tried to catch what he was saying. The words were Spanish mixed with English, fragments that didn't quite connect. But one phrase kept repeating, clear enough that I couldn't miss it. The building calling, the building calling. Casey heard it too. His face went pale. That's all he's been saying. Same thing over and over, won't respond to questions, won't look at anything except that direction. It's like he's listening to something we can't hear. I followed Jimenez's line of sight across the desert to where the old structure sat against the horizon. From this distance it looked harmless, just another piece of abandoned infrastructure left behind when the previous operation moved out. But knowing what I knew now about Neil's signals, the building seemed different. More present. We need to get him to medical. Already tried, won't move. When I touched his shoulder, he just shook his head and kept muttering. I could probably force him, but Casey didn't want to touch him more than necessary. I understood the impulse. There was something contagious about the way Jimenez sat there, completely absorbed in whatever he was hearing. Like getting too close might make you start listening for it too. Get Ortiz out here. Maybe she can sedate him. Casey jogged toward the medical building while I stayed with Jimenez. Up close, I could see his fingers moving in small, repetitive patterns against his legs, tapping out a rhythm that matched the cadence of his whispered words. The same rhythm I'd heard in Neil's recording. By the time Ortiz arrived with a sedative, Jimenez had gone completely silent. He let her inject him without resistance, his attention still fixed on the northwest horizon. The drugs took effect quickly, and Casey helped carry him to the medical bay. I walked back to my barracks that afternoon with the uncomfortable certainty that we'd lost another one. Jimenez might still be physically present, but whatever had happened to Brandon and Rivera was already happening to him. The pattern was accelerating. That night I made a decision that felt both rational and completely insane. If hearing something was the first step toward disappearing, then I wasn't going to let myself hear anything. I tore cotton from my medical kit and packed it deep into my ears, then used medical tape to seal the plugs in place. The sudden muffled silence felt strange, but better strange than gone. The rope came next. I tied one end around my ankle and secured the other to the metal frame of my bunk, leaving just enough slack to turn over but not enough to walk more than a few feet. If whatever was calling people tried to get me in my sleep, I'd wake up when the rope went tight. I felt ridiculous setting up these precautions, like a kid checking under the bed for monsters, except the monsters were apparently real and they'd already taken half my unit. The measures didn't work. 3 nights later, I woke to find Sullivan's bunk empty. No sign of struggle, no indication he'd been forced to leave. His boots were still neatly placed beside his bed, his personal effects untouched. But Sullivan himself was gone, and the only trace he'd left behind was the faint smell of desert air that shouldn't have been able to get inside the sealed barracks. I found the night watch log the next morning. Sullivan had signed in at 2200 hours for his security round. The log showed no subsequent entries, which meant he'd vanished sometime between 10 at night and dawn, just like the others. Casey disappeared 2 days after that. I'd seen him at morning mess, looking tired but functional. By evening roll call, his bunk was empty and his personal radio lay silent on his desk. Ortiz lasted another day before I walked into the medical bay and found it vacant. Her equipment still running, but no sign of where she'd gone. The base felt different with so few people left. Sounds carried farther in the thin air, and shadows seemed to linger longer in corners where voices used to fill the space. I caught myself listening for conversations that wouldn't happen anymore, waiting for familiar footsteps that would never come. Jake Elliott still ran the mess hall, though cooking for 3 people instead of 10 left him with too much time to think. Graves maintained his command routine, but I could see the strain around his eyes. He'd lost more than half his personnel to something he couldn't explain or prevent. And then there was me, walking through my daily assignments while constantly checking over my shoulder. The building sat on the horizon like it had always been there. Just another piece of desert architecture. But now I couldn't look at it without feeling watched. Like something inside was paying attention to who was left and deciding who would be next. The cotton in my ears and the rope around my ankle had become permanent fixtures. I changed the cotton daily and checked the rope knots every few hours, but I knew they wouldn't save me. Not when 5 people with perfectly functional hearing and freedom of movement had already vanished. Whatever was calling us didn't seem concerned with our precautions. It was patient enough to wait for the right moment, and strong enough to take people regardless of how carefully they tried to protect themselves. I started spending more time outside during daylight hours, keeping the building in sight but never letting myself look at it directly for too long. Just enough to monitor whether anything had changed, whether new details had appeared or familiar ones had shifted. The building never looked different, but the feeling of being observed grew stronger each day until even turning my back on the northwest quadrant felt like a mistake I couldn't afford to make. 2 nightmarish weeks had passed since Rivera disappeared, and the math was getting impossible to ignore. I'd been keeping count in my head, going through the roster again and again, but it always came back to the same terrible conclusion. Out of the original 9-person crew that had been stationed here, only 3 of us remained. Me, Graves, and Jake Elliott from the kitchen. 7 people. Gone. Walking through the outpost had become like touring a graveyard. Brandon's bunk still had his paperback thriller folded open to page 123. Rivera's desk held a half-finished letter to his sister in Phoenix, the pen lying across the paper like he'd just stepped away to grab more coffee. Jimenez's security station displayed the same rotation schedule he'd posted 3 weeks ago, with neat check marks trailing off into empty boxes. Even Neil's communications desk looked ready for her to return any moment, her headset hanging on its hook next to a cold cup of tea. The silence had weight now, real physical weight that pressed down on my shoulders when I made my rounds. Every footstep bounced too loud off the walls. Every door creak made me freeze and listen for something that never came. The outpost felt bigger somehow, like the walls had stretched when nobody was looking, creating more empty space to fill with the sound of my own breathing. I'd started talking to myself just to break the quiet, military reports mostly. Status updates to an audience of empty chairs. Communications equipment functioning normally, I'd say to Neil's vacant station. Security perimeter secure, I'd announce to Jimenez's abandoned post. It helped keep my mind working in straight lines instead of spiraling into the kind of thoughts that had claimed the others. Jake had been holding up better than I'd expected. He still showed up to the kitchen every morning at 0500 sharp, still went through the motions of preparing meals for 9 people even though only 3 remained. The routine seemed to anchor him. He'd cook full portions of scrambled eggs and bacon, set out 9 plates, then quietly pack away the extras when we didn't show up to claim them. Sometimes I'd find him standing in the mess hall after dinner, staring at the 7 empty chairs like he was waiting for their occupants to walk through the door and apologize for being late. But Graves had been getting worse. I'd noticed it over the past few days, the way his responses came a beat too slow, how his usual military precision had started to slip. He'd missed morning briefings twice, something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. When he did appear, his uniform looked rumpled, his normally sharp eyes unfocused. He'd started spending long periods outside, standing near the equipment shed and looking northwest toward the building that had become the center of all our troubles. That evening I found him there again. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of rust and gold. I'd finished my security sweep and was heading back to the barracks when I spotted his silhouette against the fence line. He stood perfectly still, shoulders squared in military posture, but there was something wrong about the way he held himself. Too rigid, too focused. "Sir?" I approached carefully, boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't acknowledge my voice or my presence. His attention was fixed on that distant structure, the one that had been drawing everyone's attention before their disappearances. In the evening light, it looked darker than usual, like a black tooth against the orange sky. "Commander Graves?" Still nothing. I moved closer, close enough to see his profile. His jaw was clenched tight, the muscles in his neck standing out like cables. His hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled. But his eyes had that same glassy quality I'd seen in Brandon's face the night before he vanished. The look of someone listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. "Sir, we should head inside." I reached out to touch his shoulder, then thought better of it. Something about his stillness warned me off. He wasn't just standing there, he was waiting. Listening, ready to move at any moment. The desert wind picked up, carrying dust and the faint smell of sage. Graves didn't even blink when it hit his face. He might as well have been carved from stone except for the steady rise and fall of his chest. "Commander?" My voice sounded small in the open space. Part of me wanted to grab him, shake him out of whatever trance had taken hold. But I'd learned to recognize the signs by now. The distant stare, the perfect stillness, the way their breathing would slow to an almost meditative rhythm. Fighting it only seemed to make things worse. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes watching him watch that building, The sun dropped lower, shadows stretched longer, and Graves never moved. Never acknowledged that I was there, never showed any sign that he remembered his own name, let alone his rank or responsibilities. Finally, I gave up. "I'll be in the barracks if you need anything, sir." He didn't respond. I didn't expect him to. Walking back across the compound, I felt the familiar weight of certainty settling in my chest. I'd seen this exact scene play out 6 times before. The transfixed staring, the unresponsiveness, the way they'd stand perfectly still until something invisible called them away. Graves wouldn't last the night. By morning, he'd be gone like all the rest, leaving behind nothing but an empty uniform and another mystery I couldn't solve. I was right. When I woke up at 0500 the next morning, his bunk was empty. The sheets were pulled back neatly, military corners still intact, like he'd gotten up to use the latrine and simply never returned. His uniform hung on its hook, pressed and ready for a duty shift he'd never report to. His boots sat beside his footlocker, laces tied in perfect regulation knots. But Graves himself had vanished into the desert night, leaving Jake and me alone in a facility built for 9. The cook took the news about as well as I'd expected, which is to say he didn't take it well at all. "What do you mean he's gone?" Jake demanded, standing in the kitchen doorway with a mixing bowl clutched in both hands. "Gone where? People don't just disappear, Mercado. Same place as the others? That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got." Jake's face went through several expressions: confusion, anger, fear, before settling on something that looked like desperate denial. He turned back to his prep station and started attacking a pile of potatoes with more force than necessary, the knife blade ringing against the cutting board like a bell. "He'll be back," Jake muttered. "Probably just went for a walk. Clear his head. People need space sometimes." I didn't argue with him. There wasn't any point. Jake would figure it out on his own when Graves failed to show up for the evening meal, then failed to show up the morning after that. Reality had a way of wearing down denial given enough time, but I could see the cracks starting to show. Over the next few days, Jake's routine began to fracture. He'd forget to turn off burners, leaving empty pans to scorch on the stove. He'd start preparing breakfast, then wander away mid-task, leaving half-chopped vegetables scattered across his workspace. Sometimes I'd find him standing in the pantry, staring at the shelves like he'd forgotten why he was there. The talking started on the 3rd day after Graves disappeared. I was doing my afternoon security check when I heard Jake's voice drifting from the kitchen. At first, I thought he was talking to me, calling out some question about dinner preferences, but when I got closer, I realized he was having a full conversation with someone who wasn't there. No, that's not right," he was saying to an empty corner near the refrigerator. "The eggs go in after you fold the flour. You'll scramble them otherwise." I stood in the doorway, watching him nod along with responses only he could hear. His hands moved as he spoke, gesturing toward invisible cooking stations, pointing out techniques to students who existed only in his mind. "Jake?" He turned toward me with a bright smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, hey there, Mercado, just giving the new guys some pointers. Kitchen safety, you know how it is." I looked around the empty room, then back at Jake. "What new guys?" His smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "The replacements. Command sent them this morning, fresh out of culinary school, most of them. Need a lot of guidance." There were no replacements. Command hadn't sent anyone. We hadn't received any communications from the outside world in over a week. But Jake's eyes held that same glassy quality I'd seen in the others, and I knew better than to push too hard against whatever reality he was constructing. "Right," I said. "Carry on." The breaking point came 2 days later. I was in the communications room going through Neil's old logs when the sound of crashing metal brought me running toward the kitchen. The noise was tremendous, pots and pans hitting the floor, cabinet doors slamming, the heavy thud of equipment being overturned. I found Jake in the middle of total destruction. He'd pulled every piece of cookware from its shelf and thrown it across the room. Dented pots lay scattered like artillery shells. Broken dishes crunched under his boots as he grabbed an industrial-sized can of beans and hurled it at the wall with enough force to leave a dent in the metal paneling. "Jake, what the hell?" "Shut up," he screamed, spinning toward me with wild eyes. "Just shut up, I know what you're doing." "I'm not doing anything." "You're talking to them, telling them lies about me." He grabbed a carving knife from the counter, holding it like he wasn't sure whether to throw it or use it on himself. "I can hear you whispering, all of you." "Jake, put the knife down." "They want me to leave," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They keep calling from outside, promising me things, showing me places I want to go." The knife shook in his grip. His face was flushed red, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. He kept looking over my shoulder like someone was standing behind me, nodding along with whatever he was hearing. "I won't go," he said firmly. "This is my kitchen. These are my people. I have responsibilities." Then, without warning, his expression changed completely. The anger drained away, replaced by a look of profound sadness. "But they sound so lonely out there," he whispered. "And I'm tired of cooking for ghosts." The knife clattered to the floor. Jake stepped over the wreckage of his kitchen and walked past me toward the exit. His movements were calm now, purposeful, like he'd finally made a decision he'd been wrestling with for days. "Jake, wait." He paused at the doorway, not turning around. "Tell them I tried," he said quietly. "Tell them I held out as long as I could." "Tell who?" But he was already walking away, heading for the main exit at a steady pace. I followed him outside, watching as he crossed the compound toward the fence line. The sun was setting again, painting everything in familiar shades of rust and gold. Jake reached the perimeter fence and kept walking, pushing through the gate like it wasn't there. His white cook's uniform made him easy to track against the dark desert scrub. He walked in a straight line toward the northwest, toward that building that had claimed all the others. "Jake!" I called after him. "Come back!" He broke into a run. I could hear him screaming as he disappeared into the gathering darkness. Not words, just raw, wordless cries that carried across the desert like the sound of something breaking apart. The voice of a man who'd finally stopped fighting whatever had been calling to him. Then the desert swallowed him up, and I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where Jake had vanished. The compound behind me felt enormous now, like a city built for thousands but inhabited by one. 8 empty bunks in the barracks, 8 abandoned workstations, 8 sets of personal belongings waiting for owners who would never return to claim them. The silence was complete. No voices from the kitchen, no radio chatter from communications, no footsteps in the corridors. Just the desert wind and the sound of my own breathing. I could wait, sit tight, follow protocols, hope that command would eventually send someone to check on us. But I knew better now. Whatever was happening here, whatever force was systematically dismantling our unit one person at a time, it wasn't going to stop with Jake. It would keep working, keep calling until I was standing outside that fence line myself, listening to voices that promised answers to questions I was afraid to ask. Or I could take control. Stop being a passive victim and start being a soldier again. The building sat out there in the darkness, patient and waiting. It had taken 8 of my people, but it hadn't taken me. Not yet. Maybe there was a reason for that. Maybe there was something I was supposed to find, some purpose I was meant to serve. I walked back inside, past the destroyed kitchen and empty barracks, and started planning. Whatever was out there in the desert, whatever had been calling to my people, I was going to find it. Not because some invisible force compelled me to, but because I chose to. Because running away or waiting to be taken felt like betraying everyone who'd already disappeared. Tomorrow I'd gear up and head northwest, toward the building that had become the center of all our nightmares. I'd find answers, or I'd join the others in whatever fate had claimed them. Either way, this waiting would finally be over. The supply room still had everything I needed. 2 full canteens, a field pack, some energy bars that tasted like cardboard but would keep me going. I grabbed a knife from the mess hall, Jake's old carving blade that he'd left behind when he vanished. The weight of it felt reassuring against my hip, even though I couldn't imagine what I'd need it for out there. My hands moved through the motions automatically, muscle memory from a dozen field operations taking over while my brain tried to process what I was actually doing. Walking alone into the desert to investigate a building that might be responsible for swallowing my entire unit. Yeah, that sounded completely rational when I put it that way. I checked my watch. 0630. If I left now, I could reach the building by late afternoon, assuming the heat didn't kill me first. The temperature would climb past 120 by midday, but I'd rather deal with that than spend another night wondering if I'd wake up to find my own bunk empty too. The radio crackled with static as I passed the communications station. For a split second, I considered calling in my plan to command. But what would I tell them? That I was abandoning my post to chase ghosts in the desert? They'd order me to stay put and wait for the extraction team that might never come. Better to ask forgiveness than permission, assuming I lived long enough to do either. The trek started easy enough. Sand and scrub stretched out in every direction, broken only by the occasional rock formation or dead bush. I'd done desert training before, knew how to pace myself and conserve water. The trick was finding a rhythm and sticking to it no matter how much your body wanted to quit. But this wasn't like training. This was walking towards something that had already claimed 7 people, with no backup and no clear plan beyond see what happens when I get there. Every step took me farther from the safety of the outpost and closer to whatever force had been picking off my unit one by one. The building stayed frustratingly constant on the horizon. No matter how long I walked, it never seemed to get much larger or reveal any new details. Just that same angular silhouette against the empty sky, sitting out there like it had been waiting for me specifically. The thought made my skin crawl, but I kept walking anyway. By noon, the heat had turned vicious. The sun beat down like a physical weight, and even with my cap pulled low, I could feel my face starting to burn. Sweat soaked through my fatigues within the first hour, and by the second I was rationing water more carefully than I'd planned. The desert didn't care about my timeline or my mission. It would take what it wanted, and I'd either adapt or die trying. I stopped every hour to rest in whatever shade I could find, which usually meant crouching behind a boulder or under an overhang that barely blocked the sun. During one of these breaks, I pulled out my binoculars and tried to get a better look at the building. Even with magnification, it remained maddeningly vague. Walls that could have been concrete or stone. No visible windows or doors, no signs of life or movement. Just a structure that shouldn't exist sitting in the middle of nowhere, waiting for me to reach it. The afternoon brought a different kind of misery. The heat had plateaued at a level that made thinking difficult, and my water supply was running lower than I'd hoped. Each step felt like walking through molasses, and the building seemed to mock me by staying exactly the same size no matter how much ground I covered. That's when the dread really started settling in. Not the rational fear of dehydration or heat stroke, but something deeper and more primitive. The feeling that I was walking towards something that wanted me to find it, that had been calling to my missing comrades just like it was calling to me now. My rational mind rejected the idea, but my gut knew better. The building grew larger as the sun started its descent toward the western horizon. What had been a distant speck that morning became a real structure with actual walls and angles. Still no details I could make out clearly, but definitely man-made. Or at least I hoped it was man-made. By late afternoon, I could see individual stones or blocks in the walls. The structure rose maybe 3 stories high, with clean lines that looked almost modern despite sitting in the middle of untouched desert. No visible entrance from my approach angle, no signs of wear or damage from the elements. It looked like someone had dropped a piece of contemporary architecture into the wasteland and left it there to wait. I reached the base of the building as the sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. Up close, the walls looked smooth and unmarked, made from some kind of gray material that could have been concrete or stone or something else entirely. No windows, no doors, no markings or signs of any kind. Just blank walls rising up from the desert floor. This was it. The thing that had been haunting our outpost for weeks, drawing people away from their posts and into the darkness. Standing next to it, I felt smaller than I had during the entire day-long trek. Whatever answers I'd hoped to find here, the building wasn't offering them up easily. I walked around the perimeter looking for an entrance or some clue about what this place was supposed to be. The walls remained perfectly smooth and featureless on all sides. No doors, no windows, no obvious way inside. Just a sealed box sitting in the sand, defying explanation. My hands were shaking when I finally worked up the courage to touch it. I expected heat from absorbing sunlight all day, or maybe cold stone that had been hidden in shadow. I expected voices like Brandon and Rivera had described. I expected something supernatural, something that would finally explain what had been happening to my unit. The wall crumbled under my palm like wet sand. I jerked my hand back and watched a section of what had looked like solid stone collapse into a pile of loose material at my feet. Not crumbling like old masonry, but dissolving like it had never been solid in the first place. Like touching a mirage and finding nothing but empty air behind the illusion. I pressed my palm against another section of wall. Same result. The material gave way instantly, falling apart as if it had only been held together by some kind of temporary force that my touch had broken. Within minutes, I'd opened a gap large enough to step through, and the edges of the hole continued to erode as I watched. The inside was empty. Not empty like an abandoned building, but empty like there had never been anything there to begin with. No floors, no ceiling, no interior walls or structure of any kind. Just more desert sand, undisturbed and unmarked, as if the building had been nothing more than a shell built around empty space. I walked through what should have been rooms, finding nothing but sand and air. The walls continued to crumble wherever I touched them, falling away like they were made of nothing more substantial than compacted dust. Whatever this place was, it wasn't really here. Not in any meaningful sense. No voices called out from hidden rooms. No signs of my missing comrades, no evidence that anyone had ever been here. No answers to any of the questions that had driven me across the desert. Just sand and the growing realization that I'd been chasing an illusion for weeks. I sank to my knees in the center of what had once appeared to be a solid building, watching the last of the walls dissolve around me in the fading light. The desert stretched out empty in every direction, unmarked by any trace of the structure that had dominated our horizon for so long. Whatever had taken Brandon and Rivera and the others, it wasn't this place. This had been nothing but a mirage with substance, a trick of light and shadow that had somehow maintained its shape long enough to drive us all mad with wondering. The real answers were somewhere else, hidden behind some truth I couldn't even begin to imagine. The sun disappeared behind the western mountains, leaving me alone in the darkness with nothing but questions and the long walk back to an empty outpost. The sun felt like it was burning straight through my skull when I opened my eyes. Sand had worked its way into my mouth between my teeth, coating my tongue with grit that made me want to gag. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The world tilted sideways and my head pounded like someone was using it for target practice. Voices reached me through the haze. Real voices, not the ones that had been calling from that building. These had weight to them, substance. Radio chatter mixed with boots crunching across desert floor. "Got him here, Captain. Looks like he's been out here a while." I managed to crack my eyes open wider. 3 figures in desert fatigue stood over me, their faces blurred by heat waves and my own dehydration. The woman in the center had captain's bars on her collar and auburn hair pulled back tight enough to give me a headache just looking at it. "Soldier, can you hear me?" She crouched down, her voice cutting through the fog in my head. "I'm Captain Gordon. You're safe now." Safe. The word felt foreign after 3 weeks of watching people disappear. I tried to speak but only managed a croak that sounded like grinding metal. One of the men, young guy with medic patches, moved closer with a water bottle. "Small sips," he said, lifting my head carefully. "I'm Frankie. You're pretty beat up." The water hit my throat like salvation, cool and real and nothing like the mirages I'd been chasing across the desert. I took another sip, then another, feeling my voice slowly return. "The building," I whispered. "Did you see the building?" The captain and the medic exchanged a look. Quick, professional. The kind that said they'd found plenty of heat casualties who babbled about things that weren't there. "What building?" Captain Gordon asked, but her tone had already shifted. Patient now, like she was talking to a confused child. "Northwest quadrant, about 15 clicks from the outpost." I struggled to sit up again, ignoring the way my vision wavered. There were others, my unit. They went there first. The third soldier, a lieutenant with documentation equipment, knelt beside me. "I'm Lieutenant Reeves. I need to get your statement while it's fresh. Can you tell me your name and unit?" "Mercado. Caden Mercado. Delta 7 Outpost, Security Detail." The words came easier now, military training taking over even when my brain felt like mush. We were 9 originally. Brandon Griffith, Jim Rivera, Theo Graves. I rattled off the names, watching Lieutenant Reeves scribble everything down in a small notebook. Each name felt heavier than the last, like I was carving their epitaphs into the desert air. "And where are these soldiers now?" Captain Gordon asked. That's where the story got complicated. How do you explain that people just vanished, that they walked towards something that might not have existed and never came back? "They disappeared," I said finally. "One by one. They heard something calling them and they walked northwest, toward that building." Captain Gordon's expression didn't change, but I caught the way she glanced at the medic. Professional skepticism wrapped in concern for a soldier who'd clearly been out in the sun too long. "How long have you been out here?" Lieutenant Reeves asked, pen poised over his notebook. 3 days, maybe 4. Lost track after... I trailed off, trying to piece together the timeline. The walk to the building felt like it had taken forever, but the walk back had passed in a blur of heat and confusion. I went to find them. The building looked real from a distance, but when I got close... "What happened when you got close?" The lieutenant's voice stayed neutral, but I could hear the doubt creeping in. It was hollow. Empty. Like a movie set. I knew how it sounded even as I said it. But they were gone. All of them. And something was still calling. Frankie the medic moved around behind me, checking my pulse and examining the sunburn across my shoulders. "Severe dehydration," he reported to Captain Gordon. "Second-degree burns on his back and neck. He's lucky we found him when we did." Lucky. Right. Lucky to be the only one left, lucky to be babbling about phantom buildings while my entire unit had vanished into the desert. I closed my eyes and tried to organize my thoughts into something that sounded sane. "The outpost should have records," I said. "Radio logs, duty rosters. You can verify what I'm telling you." "We'll check everything," Captain Gordon assured me, but her tone had that same careful patience. Right now, we need to get you medical attention. Lieutenant Reeves kept writing as they helped me to my feet. Every step felt like walking on broken glass, my legs shaky from days of dehydration. The helicopter sat about 50 yards away, rotors already spinning, and I'd never been so grateful to see military transport in my life. The voices, I said as we walked, needing to get it all down in his notebook. They knew our names, knew exactly what to say to make us follow. What kind of voices? Lieutenant Reeves asked, still writing. Familiar ones, people we knew, people we missed. Brandon heard his daughter calling, Rivera heard his mother. I paused, remembering. I heard my brother Miguel, but he's been dead for 2 years. That got their attention. Captain Gordon's step faltered for just a moment, and I saw Lieutenant Reeves underline something in his notes. But the doubt was still there in their eyes, the assumption that heat and isolation had scrambled my brain beyond reliability. They loaded me into the helicopter, Frankie immediately hooking up an IV and monitoring my vitals. The desert fell away below us, endless brown, stretching to the horizon. I pressed my face to the small window, searching for any sign of the building, any evidence that what I'd experienced was real. Nothing. Just sand and scrub brush and the mathematical certainty that 9 soldiers had been stationed at Delta 7 outpost, and only one was coming home. The flight to the medical facility passed in a haze of IV fluids and Frankie's careful monitoring. Lieutenant Reeves sat across from me, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and times, building what I assumed was either a complete record or a comprehensive case study in heat-induced psychosis. How long had the disappearances been happening? He asked at one point. 3 weeks total. Brandon first, then Rivera, then everyone else in the space of a few days. I watched him write it all down. We should have called for backup earlier, but what? But how do you report that people are walking away because dead relatives are calling to them? I laughed, but it came out bitter. Command would have assumed we'd all lost it. Maybe we had. Maybe that was the simplest explanation for everything that had happened. But if that was true, then why was I the only one who'd snapped back to reality? Why was I the only one who'd found his way back from whatever delusion had claimed the others? The medical facility appeared ahead of us, a cluster of temporary buildings surrounded by razor wire and communication towers. Real, solid, completely unlike the hollow shell I'd discovered in the desert. As we touched down, I found myself wondering if I'd ever be able to trust my own perceptions again. The next few hours blurred together in a parade of doctors, debriefings, and medical evaluations. They pumped me full of fluids, treated my burns, and ran enough tests to power a small city. Through it all, Lieutenant Reeves sat nearby with his notebook documenting every detail of my account. 2 days later, they discharged me with a clean bill of physical health and a recommendation for ongoing psychological counseling. Captain Gordon shook my hand before I left, her expression professionally sympathetic. Take care of yourself, Mercado. What you went through out there. Isolation can play tricks on anyone. I wanted to argue, to insist that it had been real, but what was the point? 9 soldiers had entered that desert and only one had come out. The math spoke for itself, even if the explanation didn't make sense. The honorable discharge came through faster than I'd expected. Psychological trauma, they called it, with full benefits and a recommendation for civilian counseling. I signed the papers and tried to feel grateful that my service record would remain clean, that I'd be able to transition back to normal life without the stigma of a Section 8. Normal life, as if anything could be normal after Delta 7. I tried calling the records office 6 months later, hoping to access the files from the outpost. Maybe there was something in the communication logs, some evidence that would validate what I'd experienced. "I'm sorry, sir," the clerk told me over the phone. "Those records have been sealed pending ongoing investigation." "What investigation?" "I'm not authorized to discuss classified materials, sir. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Classified. The word followed me for years afterward, a reminder that somewhere in a filing cabinet or computer database, the truth about Delta 7 was locked away where nobody could access it. The official story, as far as anyone knew, was that a single soldier had suffered heat-induced hallucinations after becoming separated from his unit during a routine patrol. Clean, simple, completely inadequate. I found work as a security guard at a corporate office building in Phoenix, spent my days watching cameras and walking empty hallways, trying to rebuild something resembling a normal existence. But the questions never went away. Late at night, when the building was quiet and the only sound was the hum of air conditioning, I'd find myself listening for voices that shouldn't be there. What had happened to Brandon, to Rivera, to the others? Had they found something in that desert that I'd missed? Some truth hidden behind the illusion of that hollow building? Or had they simply walked into the emptiness and never found their way back? The worst part was not knowing if it could happen again. If whatever had called to them was still out there, waiting for the next group of soldiers to stumble into its range. If somewhere in the Nevada desert voices were still echoing across the sand, speaking the names of people who would never answer back. Years passed, but I never stopped being the sole survivor of Delta 7 Outpost, never stopped carrying the weight of 9 names on a roster where 8 had been crossed out in red ink. Never stopped wondering if the building had been real, or if I'd simply been the last one to succumb to whatever madness had claimed the rest of my unit. The only certainty I had was this: something had happened out there that couldn't be explained, couldn't be categorized, couldn't be filed away in any official report. Something that existed in the space between what we know and what we fear, in the desert silence where familiar voices called out impossible names. And sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I wondered if those voices might call again.